Good evening to all of you. Thank you so much, esteemed panelists, for joining us at ETAuto webinar. We have a very nice bouquet of speakers who have joined us for this webinar. We thank you all. We thank all of you for joining in. As we can understand, the situation is crisis level, and we are trying to figure out how to really clutter or bring out some kind of clarity in a state of confusion that we are going through. We all are worried, and all are trying to find solutions to various kind of crisis problem that's coming up. The Indian automobile industry, which had been already reeling under the pressure of slowing demand, has hit a crisis with the COVID-19 lockdown, and we're not sure how long it is going to extend. There is an uncertainty about when normalcy will return. The ongoing torrid and uncertain time is unprecedented and calls for all stakeholders to come together and make a better utilization of the situation by reorganizing and understanding the ways to minimize the risk by focusing on some key areas. With this purview, we ETAuto, along with our knowledge provider, Ernst Young, or EY, that's how they are called, have conceptualized this world-around system, an online session designed to share knowledge, insight, and experience among panel members. The unprecedented crisis due to COVID-19 calls for extraordinary preparedness. ETAuto and knowledge provider EY bring global experts and OEM to provide cogent and insight managing 5 key aspects: workforce management and employment engagement, consumer and brand protection, short-term finance management, supply chain management, legal and contract dispute resolution. Now let me introduce to you our colleague, David Sandler, Global Head of Manufacturing and Mobility Advisor at EY. We have Mr. Rajiv Chawla, who is President and MD of MG. He has joined us as expert representing the passenger vehicle segment of the business. We have Mr. Vinod Agarwal, who is MD and CEO of commercial vehicle, Volvo Eicher commercial vehicle. We also have Mr. Diego Brown, CEO and MD of ETAuto vehicles, which operates in two-wheeler in India. We also have Mr. Som Kapoor, who is partner at EY. He takes care of automotive sector. We are also joined by Mr. Vinay Raghupati, partner and leader automotive sector, EY India. Over to now team EY for the presentation. Let's begin with the presentation.
Thank you, Nabil. Vinay, if you could move the slide. Thank you. This is Dave Sanders. I'm calling from Detroit, and I appreciate your attendance. You know, it's not often that I get to quote a former U.S. Defense Secretary, but it certainly fits the moment of a crisis that we're in our industry and across the world, across all businesses. You know, there's much that we know and much that we don't know about COVID. Certainly the evolution of the virus and its impact on our populations, we're learning much about. The implications for economies, clearly we're learning as we're going, but from a business perspective in our industry, you know, I think we're learning what effective crisis management is, and we're understanding the known risk, and moreover, learning to prepare and learning that in some cases needed to prepare for unknown developments, which are still ahead of us, and some of those we understand well, and some of those we don't know. And the most important is, of course, how to take care of our employees as COVID evolves. You know, while so much is unknown, you know, we're learning every day from each other and what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's been a very interesting development. In EY, we've shared our experiences with our clients across the globe, and that's probably one of the most important learnings we've had to date is how much we can, you know, learn about the situation that we are all in. I think our challenge is addressing what we can't anticipate, those things that we may know in the days and weeks that are coming, but maybe more important, the things that we can't anticipate, which Rumsfeld clearly pointed out. And that's really the point of this discussion is how to think through the crisis. So the next page, Vinay. Thanks. Critical to everything, in our view, is resilience. And resilience, just by definition, is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. There's going to be plenty of time for us to look back to see who was prepared and why. But what's clear is as the virus has moved across the globe, the impacts to our countries and to our companies has been severe. In the U.S., where I reside, we clearly have had some massive challenges in the industry. All assembly plants are closed, and we're beginning to really see the challenges of a lean and single point supply chain. I think the issue that lies ahead is how we are going to recover. We do know we will. The question is how we're going to do that. And then next, as you all know in India, to be better prepared for the next crisis, which will come. We do know that if we look back over the last few years. What we're seeing globally right now as I spend time with our automotive teams and clients is a focus really in the short term, which we're going to talk about at length here on crisis management and operational liquidity risk for ecosystems, so of the entire value chains. And then in the medium term, how to restart global, complex, multi-tier supply chains that operate on a just-in-time basis when parts of that supply chain are not functioning, and where governments have varied policies and where employees are still at risk. So we clearly are not over this. I think it's important that we think both in the immediate term, or what we call in EY the now, and we also consider very much the next and beyond, which Vinay and team will pick up and take forward from here. I look forward to the questions. Vinay, I'm going to turn it to you.
I was just saying that while David did speak about the now, next and beyond and the transnational impact of COVID, from an India perspective, some of the headwinds were clearly visible even before COVID hit us. So it wasn't, unlike, let's say, China's performance before SARS, it wasn't quite a business which was rocking on all fronts. There was clearly a declining trend as far as GDP is concerned. There was a declining trend as far as consumer spend growth is concerned. And we also had issues across industries, not just auto. I mean, all of us on this call, I think, would be fairly familiar with the percentage numbers, and depending on what baseline you take, the percentage number could be slightly more or slightly less than the ones that you see on this slide. But it was beyond just auto. FMCG was relying more on value growth and less on volume growth just before COVID, and there was also a significant issue across real estate and infra, including a bit of a liquidity crunch. Whilst there were headwinds, what COVID has done is it has essentially compounded that impact and has affected the entire ecosystem. So, I mean, we've just put a poll of polls. Anyone who can forecast accurately in the current market will be king, which is why we played it safe and said, let's take an average of forecasts we're receiving across multiple agencies. But clearly, COVID has compounded this, has resulted in a further contraction as far as GDP growth rate is concerned, which is also visible in the auto index, the Nifty auto index, which is a high correlation to the macros of the economy. So there is a significant decrease, almost a 32% decrease in the auto index, although from what I see today, the markets were slightly favorable. But given the decline that we've had over the last couple of weeks, this will take a long while before we claw our way back to the top. The other point I wanted to make is, over time, the auto ecosystem has done a great job at optimizing a very linear value chain. So we've been conscious of cost and quality parameters, and we've built a linear value chains all the way from OEMs to component manufacturers, and also now incorporating the mobility ecosystem at the front end. whilst there have been significant short-term implications, there's, of course, we hear daily from CM and ACMA about some of the challenges that the component manufacturers and the dealerships and OEMs are facing in terms of inventory sitting at the dealerships, in terms of the number of walk-ins that have decreased from a passenger two-wheeler standpoint, in terms of the challenges that the commercial vehicle segment is facing. And also in terms of some of the major tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers facing problems. But I just wanted to leave you with two critical questions. When we have historically worked with at optimizing a linear value chain, what happens when parts of that value chain are missing, or things that you cannot quite rely on? As an example, whilst we are dependent on component imports from China, depending on the OEM, the percentage of components being imported from China could vary from anywhere between 7-8% to 25-30%. In certain categories, China itself is dependent on importing components from other geographies, Germany, for example. And therefore, what happens when different geographies get out of the lockdown at different phases, and therefore you have a supply chain which is never complete until all the countries are back to normal? And how do you respond to that change is a critical question that the ecosystem needs to answer. And I thought I'd highlight that. The second one is, of course, how do organizations across conserve cash and react to some of the changes that they're noticing at the front end of the business? The good news, however, is that if you were to look at how India has performed historically, it's always bounced back. I mean, a lot of us reading newspapers go through multiple alphabets in terms of how the bounce back can happen. A V, a U, a W. And whilst I'm not here to predict which way it will swing, clearly, in my view, a complete V is a little ruled out. But irrespective of which alphabet the Indian economy will take, I think one has to be optimistic about the chances that the Indian economy has in terms of bouncing back once this crisis is mitigated. However, the point we also want to leave behind with a lot of you is that the normal of tomorrow is not going to be the normal of yesterday. So if you were expecting things to go back to normal in the short and medium term as far as 3 months ago or 4 months ago is concerned, that is something that we should think about and park aside. And we should prepare for a normal of tomorrow, which is slightly more variable in terms of how we have to operate as parts of the ecosystem in tomorrow's times. The other good news is, if you were to, I was speaking to our teams in China. Ironically, some of our partners in China were stuck in Wuhan, delivering work for clients, and have been stuck there for a while. And we were looking at what has happened in China over the last couple of weeks, particularly when the lockdown has been lifted. The story is mildly positive. Things are getting back to normal. There has been a resumption of production, may not be at 100% capacity, but there's been a resumption of production at a vast majority of OEM locations. There's been a significant number of dealers who also come back to work and have opened up their shops. But you must realize that China was actually hit at both ends of its value chain because of two very specific variables. They had a Chinese New Year, due to which dealers were stocking up inventory in the December-January timeframe, and due to which a lot of workers also went back to their houses. And COVID hit them right in the middle of that whole migration of both labor as well as people. And post-COVID, they had to deal with a problem at both ends of their value chain. They had significantly higher inventory than normal when it came to the dealer network, and they had a significant disruption of their labor force because of the holidays that everyone took and got stuck in their respective work locations. So they're, of course, doing a lot to get the whole thing streamlined, but the initial feedback we're getting from China is moderately positive. People are getting back. Of course, life has changed. It's almost now a social norm to be careful as far as public spaces is concerned. You are almost frowned upon if you do not follow those norms. People are finding innovative ways and means of dealing with issues at both the OEM and the component level. They are working closely with the financial ecosystem to extend line of credit, look at aspects related to how to substitute components in cases of components coming from countries which have still not begun production. So they are doing a lot, and I think a lot of us in the Indian auto ecosystem can learn from what they're doing. But I think we should also be moderately positive that whatever normal the country gets back to, even if it is not normal, the normal that we were used to in the past, we should be able to bounce back in terms of eventually doing well as an organization and ecosystem. How long that will take, how many quarters will go by before consumers here are confident enough and demand gets back to decent levels is currently anybody's guess, and we are not venturing one right now in this discussion. Something that we will definitely question some of the expert panelists that we have later during the talk. What we are hearing from most of the clients we're speaking to, and I will at the end of this invite David for a few comments on what he's hearing globally. A lot of you would have seen a lot of thought capital and knowledge in terms of what clients are speaking about, what organizations are speaking about. And over the last month or so, we've spoken to around 120 odd organizations spanning the OEM and the OES fraternity in India. And I think you can broadly summarize what we are hearing into three buckets. Everyone is looking at mapping multiple scenarios. So scenario number one is, of course, if there is a fast recovery and catch up, then what do we do? Scenario number two is if a large part of the year is lost to COVID, and I'm talking about the calendar year, is lost to COVID, then what do we do? And scenario number three is a slightly more bleak scenario in terms of what happens if the COVID impact goes beyond just one fiscal or one calendar year. But while organizations are looking at multiple scenarios, they are tabulating their responses under three buckets, which I think is fairly logical. One is, how do we manage the crisis of now, which is, I'm in a lockdown mode. How do I keep my people engaged? What do I do to keep my operations somewhat continuous to be ready for the post-lockdown period? How do I conserve cash in a lockdown mode where revenue is hard to come by? A lot of the questions related to how do I manage the immediate crisis. The second bucket that a lot of organizations are thinking about is, how do I manage the post-lockdown period, which we have called the next, which is roughly a quarter or couple of quarters after restarting. I mean, for all practical matters, everyone will end up restarting the businesses from scratch in certain cases. So how do I manage the issues that I'm going to face from a next standpoint? And while I'm busy tackling the now and next issues, how do I build resilience so that if there is a reoccurrence of this, or if there is something that happens which beyond the current knowns, how do I secure my business for future shocks and future unknowns, which we've called beyond? So the structure of today's presentation and the structure of today's panel discussion later in the day will follow a similar approach. How do we manage the now crisis? What do we do from a next time frame? And how do we think about building resilience from a beyond point of view? But before going into aspects related to the next and beyond, a lot of you would have gone through aspects related to your individual organizations or your individual firms rushing to meet some of the now concerns. I just thought I'd spend 2 minutes talking about some of the concerns we've heard from at least the Indian players. Topmost priority is liquidity. So how do I manage the immediate crisis? What do I do from a cash management standpoint? How do I put in place a cash management war room? How do I ensure that some of the decisions around this is structured and centralized? Historically, there have been organizations which have looked largely at top line and bottom line in terms of P&L implications. But how do I now build some focus around cash and cash availability is I think, a primary concern. The second concern, and linking back to the original comment that David started off with, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. How do I make critical decisions based on limited information? I mean, if any one of us can claim to know everything about what is going to transpire over the next 6 months, he'll be the biggest soothsayer in the current market. But how do I make critical decisions based on limited information and certain unknowns? And how do I ensure that I have, to the best of my capability, optimized my organization for some of these decisions? Very critical point, and therefore a lot of people are thinking about, where do I source as much information from? How do I ensure that most of my decisions are adequately thought through, and the root cause for a lot of the issues I'm facing is also detailed. The third thing that we are hearing is, how do I manage uncertainty around externalities? And in brackets, we've put it as an externality from an OEM standpoint, but every organization will have externalities. A supplier's externalities will include the OEM, and OEM's externalities will include the dealer. A dealer's externality will include the consumer and the OEM. So how do I manage uncertainties that I have around multiple externalities? And linked to point number 2, how do I factor some of these uncertainties into my decision making? The fourth thing that we are hearing a lot about is, what do we do when it comes to managing a disrupted workforce? So some of the workforce will be fearful, some of the workforce will want to stay away, and some of the workforce will also be slightly less productive when they get back. So what are the guidelines, what are the SOPs, what is the clarity that I can give to my workforce, particularly for an ecosystem like automotive, where shop floors are as critical as anything else in the entire value chain? And how do I ensure that I give a communication of safety from a shop floor perspective? And how do I ensure that the migrant workforce, which to a certain extent is dispersed right now, is again integrated and brought back to a central manner? And finally, how do I keep essential operations going? So what do I do from a essential operations standpoint? What do I do in terms of managing my payrolls, my payables, and aspects related to that? Which I think comes to, and this leads me to the 5 themes that we want our panel discussion to focus on. One is around workforce management and employee health, which are some of the points that I made earlier in terms of labor and people. The second is in terms of short-term finance management, in terms of liquidity and cash. The third is supply chain management, in terms of how do I ensure that there is complete clarity in each aspect of my supply chain, and how do I plan for certain uncertainties. The fourth is customer and brand. So how do I react to changing preferences from a consumer standpoint and from a customer standpoint? And how do I react to that? And how do I protect my brand in a world where there'll be significant competition to own that digital footprint? And the fifth one is, how do I manage aspects related to risk, legal, and contract dispute resolution? So there is a lot of thought capital that EY in particular has released around these 5 themes, which a lot of you will find access to in public domains. But we believe that the focus of a crisis management task force will be to get into detailed aspects of each of these 5 work themes. And some of the panelists later will also talk through their point of view when it comes to these 5 essential themes that the auto sector needs to react to. I'll hand it over to Som for a couple of minutes before getting back to close the discussion and open it up for a panel discussion. Som, would you want to quickly talk through a couple of these themes in detail?
Sure, Vinay, thank you. So actually, I'm going to follow that whole principle of the now themes. This is something that we probably need to do now. I'm going to talk about, I believe, the most important thing right now for all of us is, how do we think about our workforce? What do we do about our employee health, etc.? I think one of the biggest facets we face as an industry is that, say, 50% of our contractual workforce is probably migrant labor force as well. So a bunch of them have either already gone off or they're very secure wherever they are. But getting all of them back onto the shop floor cannot be done overnight. You'll need to think through of plans of how you get all of them back. You'll need to find ways of working back with people like them so that they can be very easily got back into the workforce. I think what are the non-negotiables as of today? I think the first one is probably a top-down governance with decisive and creative leadership. Those words are very important. Decisive because everyone needs a complete direction with which they're working towards, and creative. I mean, thanks to all the unknowns David mentioned, we need to be creative in these times. The other thing we need to be very focused on is communication with employees, policies, messaging. All of that is extremely important. I'm sure, later during our conversation, we'll figure out how different organizations have done that. Accessibility, usability of health, safety information, risk assessment matrices. We also probably need to start thinking about when this workforce comes back, what will be the new normal? What are the SOPs that you need to build for a post-COVID working environment? I was in a conversation yesterday where a simple question came up about social distancing for the next 1 month in a factory. How do we manage that? Does everybody need to wear gloves? Does everybody need to wear masks, in different places of the workforce? So those are the kind of decisions that you need to start to think about when it comes to workforce management. Coming down to supply chain, what we've done is supply chain, like Vinay also mentioned, that there's a two-way inventory system, at least from an OEM perspective. But even from an OES perspective, they probably need components from all over the world to be make sure that they aggregate, they get the components right, and they supply it. How is your integrated sales and operations planning doing? What we did was we actually just built a small matrix to a few key dimensions and manage them to the risk exposure that they have. This crisis management and governance right now is probably the key thing you can do to keep your supply chain running. How are you remotely? What are your remote working capabilities? What is the crisis governance and communications setup you've built? Have you set up an end-to-end compliance support business? These are days wherein supply side constraints are going to be huge. I mean, from a simple fact that we were already going through BS4 to BS6, we have a few norms coming up in the next few years. So the OES industry and the OEM industry were having enough to do already. And now on top of that, they need to have about, how do they figure out what import dependency they have from China, which can be mitigated if that is the case for us, or maybe not China for some brands from Europe, which need to be mitigated. And the risk exposure to just that procurement and supplier management is extremely high in these times. And finally, from a customer and brand protection, I mean, if you just look out the rollouts that you need to do across touch points, customer facing, team training, service, monitoring, what do you do to protect your customer? How do you manage your communication with the customer? Your customer could be a dealer as well. How do you manage that relationship going over a period of time? So what we've tried to do is give you a 2x2 matrix between a customer reach program and a time to realize. And we've also broken it down to what do you need to do today? What do you need to do between 2 and 30 days from today? What do you need to do from 2 to 3 months from now? What are the immediate customer mitigation aspects to it? What scenarios do you need to build for demand changes? I wish we were in a time frame where demand was kept certain over a period of time. But how will demand change is a very big question, because questions you need to start answering for your own product sexes. How do you think the customer is going to come out and react? Because it's not just about a 1 month sit at home. A lot of people will start thinking about very differently to the way they were approaching their life as usual. A lot of them may come back to say that we want to lead a slightly slower life. A lot of them may want to come back and say we want to change the mode of communication we used to work with. A lot of companies may think about we may change the way we actually work with people. This form of webinars is perfectly fine to do conferences rather than getting people to travel all over the world. So you will need to start to think about how the consumer will start thinking about over a period of time for the particular product that you go ahead and sell. Once you've kind of got some strategies done over a now and a beyond, that's when you need to start figuring out, in case, how do you prepare your product segment for the beyond rather than for the now? The customer of today or the customer of yesterday will behave differently to the customer of tomorrow. And thinking about that customer will be very, very important. Finally, my final submission is on the risk management, legal, contract. I mean, the government's already come out with 9 advisories, 22 notifications. There are daily updates. There are 150 compliance obligations that have arisen because of COVID-19. Over 100 countries have issued about 350 regulatory notifications to deal with. There are 7 state and central governments of India that have invoked powers and provisions under the Epidemics Act. Does this change anything with the way you work with your labor force? Does this change anything the way you work with your suppliers? Does this change the way you work with your dealers? Force majeure. Are companies going ahead and getting force majeure applications in? How does that change to the contractual obligations you have with companies on both sides of the value chain? I mean, those are the kind of decisions which has to be taken by decision makers who are over here under the now theme. And criticality to respond within a time frame is the most important criteria when it comes to any risk management, legal or contractual dispute resolution programs that you need to set in. Vinay, can we go to the final slide?
Thanks, Tom. So just closing out what we are hearing from a next and beyond the perspective, while Som spoke of some of the responses that organizations are making on the now, from a now standpoint, in a post-COVID environment, how does one manage this network requirement in terms of supply chain? So how does one go about thinking through a supply chain in terms of linear versus network? What kind of solutions does one need to deploy, and how do we manage both demand side and supply side unpredictability and variables there? How does one continue to conserve cash, not for the sake of conserving cash, but also for the sake of investing in the disruptive competition and environment that we are working within? We are right in the midst of a transition from BS4 to BS6. The tractor industry, parts of it will go into a transition later in the year. How does one manage innovation requirements that are coming through from consumers? Quick point around how firms should think about managing and owning consumer relationships in a digital marketplace. How do you establish yourself as a source of differentiation in the consumer? So Som spoke about some of it. How do I imbibe more and more digital in my thinking as far as how do I meet the consumer requirements, right from awareness to consideration to negotiation to closure? There is another aspect of how one can manage the regulation and scrutiny that Som spoke about, which is forcing firms to take a more robust view on risk management. And finally, how do I re-baseline everything? And this is the point we were making earlier. How do I think through a new normal, which could be very different from the earlier normal? Our last slide, which we will talk about before we open it up for the panel, is what are some of the things that you need to be thinking about, and therefore what are some of the aspects that we are helping the firms with. Point number 1 is, of course, aspects related to scenario planning and response clarity. How do we think through the next and beyond themes? How do we help you build a roadmap for that, identify response themes and risk mitigation mechanisms? Point number 2 is around setting up a cash management office. We spoke a lot about short-term, long-term liquidity. We spoke about cash forecasting, and we also spoke about how you need to centralize some of these decisions and make sure that you are monitoring burn rate on almost a daily basis. How do you set up a spend management war room, which is all to do about OPEX and CAPEX? How do you look at alternative funding solutions? So a lot of the first 3 buckets that we've listed on this slide are related to the aspects of now and the immediate next. But going forward, how do I set up a digital manufacturing and supply chain control tower so that any constraints that exist in my value chain, I discover them faster, I respond to them better, and I have a more agile value chain at the end of the day. And on the front end, people are now talking about a contactless purchase journey, whether in the B2B space or in the B2C space. But how do I build a digital sales organization which leverages a contact purchase journey right from awareness all the way down to negotiation? Before I just go down to the panel, David, I just wanted to check if you wanted to say some things in terms of similar work that we're doing globally.
Yeah, Vinay, I would say a couple things. I mean, clearly we're looking at, especially at the OEM and tier 1 level, visibility into their lower tier suppliers. I think it's a fairly common problem globally that the OEMs do not have deep visibility into their supply chains. It's one part contractual, one part is the way it's been. And I think we all know that a 4th or 5th tier supplier can shut an entire supply chain down. So there's a lot of activity to identify troubled suppliers early, whether it's operational or financial, assess them, and then act. And that seems to have a huge amount of focus right now. It's really on those inbound relationships, but it's also on the outbound relationships. I think we're seeing, especially in the U.S. and Western Europe right now, a lot of dealer problems. In the U.S., many of the dealers only have parts and service working. They don't have sales working. And it's a real liquidity challenge at the point of sale. What it's coming down to, Vinay, is that we see companies taking one of two paths. Either they're defensive and retrenching, or secondly, they're using this kind of downtime as an opportunity to accelerate key programs. There's one particular one, Japanese OEM, very much focused on accelerating its digital selling processes as an example. So that's a few things that we're seeing globally, Vinay.
Thanks a lot, David. So I'll hand it over to Nabil to manage the panel discussion. We've got an eminent panel here representing the industry too. Nabil, over to you.
Thank you, Vinay, and entire ETAuto, EY team, and David especially for joining in. Now let's move to the OEM segment. We'll now have the perspective from the OEMs, and to start with, because Diego has to leave at 6 p.m. So Diego, I want to hear from you. Every panelist will be given 5 minutes to speak on the subject that has been shared by EY on workforce management, employment engagement, consumer brand, and short-term finance management. What are your views, if you could tell us, from the two-wheeler and three-wheeler perspective in 5 minutes?
Fixed costs. So apart from that, the working capital cycle, when it is running, you always generate money from receivables or from sales, and then you pay the supplier credit. Now the working capital cycle at this point of time is stopped. It's at the standstill. When the working capital cycle is at the standstill, it means there is no production, no sales, no new receivables. But the supplier credit, which is there for last 2-3 month purchases, for that, of course, the organizations have to make the payments. So it's a major pressure on the working capital. So fixed cost, working capital, and then the companies who are more leveraged, they are going to face more difficulties. So I think the companies who are having cash surpluses or who are having good balance sheets, I think they will be able to manage it in a much, much better manner. And then, of course, the third most important thing is that I think you have to prepare yourselves that when the lockdown opens or when your plants start working again, the company should hit the ground running. Basically, the production should come to streamline very fast. Otherwise, that itself could be a major problem, because you have to manage your supply chain, you have to manage your workmen, like all the, if some workmen had gone to their villages, and this is also harvesting season, a lot of people get busy in their harvesting, and to get them back onto the factories, it's very difficult. So I think we have to remain in touch with them. We have to, all our supply chain people, they have to remain in touch with our suppliers, especially the difficult suppliers where you are anticipating that there will be some shortages or there will be more challenging situations. So you have to remain in touch with them, so that when the plants start, that time we should be able to get back to the normal in absolutely in full blast. And then the fourth most important thing is that we have to remain in touch. The communication is very, very important.
So, Mr. Agarwal, just one point. Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers have revised the projection for financial year 2020, and they are saying that the commercial vehicle segment will degrow by 26%. A brief view on this only.
It's a very, as I mentioned in the beginning, like we are already at 13, 14 or 14, 15 level. And then if the GDP drops down to 1% or 2% because of the economic activity, I think we have to anticipate some drop further, because that's why I said we have to be ready for 2-3 scenarios. And one of the first scenario will be with further drop in the industry level. I can't tell you that how much it will be. It may be 10%, it may be 5%, it may be, because already the industry is down almost 50%, 40 to 50% with respect to the earlier peak. So that's very, very critical, and we have to be adjust ourselves to the changing scenario. We have to cut down our costs, we have to bring down the break-even levels, we have to do the cost reduction programs, we have to do the better price management, we have to do everything which is there in the copybook. We have to put it into implementation, put it into practice. I think that's going to be the key to your success. So, and then of course, remaining in touch
Thank
with
you
your
so much.
employees.
So we are running out of time, so I'll have to quickly go to Mr. Grafi.
Definitely is very challenging scenario for entire industry, not only in India, but on a global base. That is the big difference respect to the big crisis that we have seen in the past, because it's hitting America as well as Asia, Europe, and all the other countries all across the world. A crisis on which nobody obviously was prepared to face. And so the bad thing is that this thing has come so fast to us, finding ourselves very, very unprepared to face it. I agree that most probably we have to look at the evolution of this crisis in three phases. Definitely there will be one phase while lockdown will still on. Personal expectation is that it not be so soon that lockdown, at least in India, will be lifted. I think that April and also some more is something for which we have to expect, looking at the trend of the spread in the last couple of weeks. So definitely during this period, the main concern will be about how to manage cash and cash availability within the company, because without revenues, without collection, at the same time you will have to manage expenses for vendors, for fixed costs, and so definitely a big challenge in the next 4 to 5 weeks will be how to manage cash to maintain, how to say, the company active and operative, and to be able to prepare ourselves for the next phase that is post-lockdown period. Suppose that it will not again be so short. I agree that it can be looked in perspective of 1 or 2 quarters mainly, during which we will have to face with very, very big drop in demand from market, and at the same time we'll have to be very lean and very flexible in terms of operating cost to maintain a decent level of profitability. After that, we can expect that after 1 or 2 quarters, there could be some revival in demand. Personally, I want to think positive that after that will be slowly revival in demand, and how it will take still some long time to come back to a more, how to say, normal situation. This is something that is valid in India as well as for any market where we are operating, it depends if it is Europe or if it is Asia or North America. So definitely the next 12 months will be very tough and very challenging for the entire industry, and mainly automotive. And we have, again, to be prepared, defining some priorities that will be our capacity to manage cash and cash availability within the company, be flexible and lean in terms of operating expenses, and try to work as much as possible on cost reduction to maintain a decent level of profitability, because I expect that big drop in demand, it's how impossible to define at which percentage will be there. This is at least my view of as far as I can see from last couple of weeks perspective.
Thank you
So
so much.
can you
Rajiv, I would like to bring you here.
Right. Okay. So So
Yes.
thank you guys. I was
Yes,
saying
Rajiv,
that
please go ahead.
I would like to. Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity. I would like to thank ENY that they have put all the structure. But I would like to touch few points which probably we have not touched upon right now, because all of us, I'm sure, know about all these cash issues and everything. We are facing serious issues. I like to say this is once in a lifetime kind of crisis, right? Or once in a century kind of crisis. So it requires a very different kind of an approach. Apart from handling all these issues, I think one important thing is which we are trying to focus on is, apart from health and cash, I think the care part, the care of community, the care of your stakeholders, show that human connection, show that human touch. I know all of us have problem of cash and everything, but I think it's not only about cash, it's about cash, it's about intentions and efforts to help each other. The community, when we talk about community, it's not only dealer or suppliers community, it's also community around your factory, community around your offices. These guys are there with you in your good days. So can I position my brand as, or can I do as that I'm your friend in your bad days? I think that's what I think matters at this point of time. And at MG we are trying to do a little bit. And again, the money is, we are not donating huge crores of rupees, but in terms of our employees' time, I think they are spending a lot of time. So we have got a team of around 50 people, which is just focused on community support group right now. It may be as simple as providing food to the migrant labor at the border. So I think that's what is important. This time also will pass. We all know Immediate problem is first 3 months. I think part of March, April, May, and maybe June. This is the severe crisis, and after that, things will start coming back to a new normal, as Soman we were talking. Yes, cash has to be managed, and communication is important. But let me talk about communication. What kind of communication we are talking about? I think at different levels of organization, we need to have the nuances of communication. The moment you talk about, I'm not going to give you salary increase, or there will be headcount reduction or salary reduction and things like that, people start reacting in a different way. Because it depends on the maturity and the level of those kind of people. So I think there are huge nuances in communication. Different people need to be told the same thing in a different way, probably. So I think that's the smartness. I think we need to have it. And again, one thing that goes to the culture of the company. If the companies are agile, move fast, flexible, and if we keep telling this thing that listen, every week scenario will change, and all of us know, by the way, every second day things are changing in India as well as globally. Nobody knows exactly the end game, how it is going to end up, but we all know things will improve. Number one, it will hit the peak. It will start coming down again. It may hit a new peak. There may be a sine curve. Maybe one big peak, smaller peak, and maybe 3 4 months it will continue that way. This There may be a profound impact of this virus in society in terms of change of behavior, change of everything, but we can think of it later on. And also, I would not like to get into hundreds of things, which in some slides we talked about it. I think let's not overwhelm people. In this audience, I think Nabil said 1,000 people are there. My message would be, guys, do not get overwhelmed. Don't feel, because too much of information is coming right now. Don't think too much about 1 year from now. Let's try to get the patient out of ICU right now. Okay, this is immediate 2 or 3 months. But yes, we need to have a sight on, as top managers, we need to have sight on middle term and long term for sure. But step at a time. Don't overburden ourselves with hundreds of issues in our mind, because that's going to confuse us. And as leaders, it will not give the right message to the employees. So this is what I would like to say.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, and everybody who has presented such a cogent and deep analysis to the situation. We understand that we are in a situation which is like never seen before, never heard before. We are trying to just put things in perspective. If we can provide some kind of solace, some kind of intelligence to the industry, that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to bring only the experts and those who have really understood the business, who can really provide some kind of information. So I'll tell you that we have got overwhelming response. Over 1,000 people have joined, and I'm really sorry many were not able to join because we have a limitation of only 1,000 people. We have about 400 questions. We'll try and see how many of them can be taken in this panel. I would request every panel member to stay back for next 20 minutes, and if we can try and answer as many as possible from those questions. So first question goes for Mr. Diago. Can you, okay, we are not going to take questions brand specific. We'll take only questions which are overall industry specific. So first question comes from Siraj Khan. He says automotive field in India is highly cyclical. With COVID, it appears that dealerships are highly cluttered now. Rajiv, if you can address, and then probably Vinay can chip in. But we need very sharp and pointed question because we have very less time left.
Rajiv, you want to go? He's asked
yes,
about
Rajiv, your answer. Automotive field in India is highly cyclical. With COVID, it appears. Yeah.
So Vinay, sorry, can you go ahead, because I didn't understand the question. Maybe you go ahead and then I'll take it through from you.
The question was on cyclicity of the business and impact on the dealership network in the immediate short term.
Yeah. See, I'm a proponent of a very simple philosophy on the network, and which I've been saying it much before this whole virus issue happened. And that I think we need to consolidate our dealerships. We need to have less number of dealers and more area, and try to focus that the dealers discounting doesn't happen. We need to focus on that. We need to come out from wholesale concept to the retail concept. This is what we are trying to do it right from the day one in MD. But I think this is the time when I think golden opportunity for even OEMs to make sure that the network gets consolidated. We select less number of dealers, good dealers who can grow with the brand, and so that we can even avoid the discounting and can also preserve the brand. So I think I'm very, very clear on some of these aspects, and it's a golden time for all the brands to do it.
Diego, you want to say something on the dealerships and the nature of dealerships going forward?
Well, I think that apart from OEM, definitely dealers are the one that will be mostly affected during this period, both during lockdown and after lockdown, we believe that. Definitely we can forecast that there will be big shortfall of footfall at dealers and the showroom even after lockdown, because definitely some level of fear for people will be there. So at least what I think that automotive has to think about is to support them introducing some tools for, how to say, creating and managing demand independently by physical presence of customer dealership, like, for example, online booking, online selling. I think this kind of model could be very helpful for dealer to maintain their level of business at an acceptable level, at least until the fear of COVID will be completely disappeared. So definitely something that we are thinking about seriously, at least as a Piaggio, both for three-wheeler and two-wheeler, to provide them with effective tools to create demands, create the bookings, keep contact with customer from virtual point of view rather than from physical point of view. I think this is definitely a way. Another way definitely is to invest on brand, because in the next period, for sure, the value of the brand will be even more important than in the past. And so I think that dealer will have to invest from this perspective, creating again the connection to customer and giving them the perspective of value of the brand wherever it is there. So I think these two factors are essential for dealer to maintain the good level of business and profitability, at least for the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you, Diego. Next question comes for David. This is Mr. Ashok Bhasin. He's a senior industry person. He asked, what is the impact on shared mobility, and what kind of impact do you see on EV going forward in two-wheeler and passenger vehicle with COVID coming up?
Could you repeat the question one more time?
COVID on shared mobility and electric vehicles.
I'll just repeat the question. Question is, what is the impact on
what kind of impact?
Yeah, I have the question. I mean, the immediate impact on shared mobility is pretty dramatic in the very, very short term, right? There's been a huge drop in usage of shared mobility across the United States and to some degree in Western Europe. But I think it's going to be all that more important to rethink the issues of shared mobility in the context of post-COVID, right? We're going to come into an area, and I think some of the speakers have rightly pointed out, there's going to be concern about gathering. There's going to be early concern, certainly about proximity to other people. We know that in the short run, Uber Pool, as an example, has been stopped in the U.S. So I think over time, the mobility, which really hadn't factored issues about proximity into the models that we worked on and understand, it's going to have to be part of the equation going forward. But that's no different than I think everything we've talked about here, whether it's manufacturing or dealer operations. We're going to have to consider the issues of post-COVID and how we design experiments and how we design new business models in the mobility space, with the sharing of assets probably at the top of that list.
So we have very less time, so we'll have to be very brief in answers. We can accommodate maximum number of questions that way only. So the next question comes from Suraj Kumar. He wants to understand, the dealers do not have reserves on surplus. They primarily work on meet their demands. They have that much only to meet the demands. Today, the cost of sales is on the highest. Most of the reserves and surplus have been busy expanding and increasing the operational costs. Considering that these lockdown will further impact their business, what is your view on it? Rajiv, if you can address, and if Vinod, he can join in.
I think Vinod was also talked about this issue of, it depends on the leverage what firms have. That's true for the dealers also. Like, if some dealers are over leveraged at this point of time, interest outgo itself will be a big problem. So I think, I know it's very easy for me to say, but I think they need to find out a way of deleveraging over a period of time. And in the meantime, cut costs. So basically, one question you ask is, at what point do you break even? So it's supply and demand side you need to match, and and you break even. So here in this case, your revenue and cost you need to match. And see whatever, sometimes maybe a small surgery would be required to do it. So I don't think so. It's a good news at this point of time for all those dealers who are spending in a big way and they have taken big loans and they have left. So I think that's what I think they need to deleverage, in my opinion. And I would like to believe that already this exercise had started in India because of demonetization and GST, and already some work was in the progress. But maybe this is the last straw, and this is the last scavenging or cleaning probably will happen because of this virus. Um, so this is one thing. Second is cost management for sure. This is how you need to do it. And the third is revenue growth. Now, revenue growth is at the cost of some competitor because the market is going to be down. GDP is down, industry will be down, your segment will be down, and every competitor will try to outsmart you. So how do you really get the revenue growing? I think this is very important to focus on revenue side also. How can you be smarter than competition? And that's what probably you need.
I think if I may add to what Rajiv is saying, I think the most important for dealers will be to ensure that their working capital is minimized. So that I think the first is that we should not have any much inventories with them. So if you are able to release their inventories, I think that will help them a lot. Second thing is this period of lockdown, I think we have to do more and more programs on digital platform, like for example, competency building. For example, if BS6 is now implemented, BS6, a lot of competency building is required. So if we could spend this time to do the competency building, that will also help in keeping the technicians or keeping the dealer manpower engaged, because it will be very critical to retain these people. And if we lose these competent people from dealers, I think that is going to become very, very tough for the customers and as well as for the BS6 management. So therefore, to ensure that dealers don't lose the competent people, they are absolutely very, very efficient in working capital management. And then, of course, we have to work together with dealers, as Rajiv said.
This is very interesting. Mr. Anil Kumar, he wants to understand, first of all, let somebody answer that. Do we require globalization in view of the imported coronavirus scenario when everything in our business is getting grounded, halt due to this virus attack? Can we now at least think of 100% globalization under Make in India program? So, very contrarian view here. So David and
I think I'll take an attempt on this. I think what is globalization? It goes into a philosophical thing. It's basically sharing of ideas, people, technology, and resources. And that's what globalization is all about, right? And that's how we enrich each other. And as a society, we improve. It's not about component only. So don't look at this crisis from the perspective of component.
Deep Nair, he wants to understand in this challenging scenario, will new product launch help garner market share, thereby holding numbers? Rajiv and Diego can answer this.
Yeah, as I made a comment that we need to come out of this crisis hale and hearty on one hand, but we cannot take our sight away from medium and long-term plans. And this shall too pass. We all know this. It's a question of time. 1 year is going to be tricky. 3 or 4 months are going to be very severe, and after that it will be a new normal. And by end of this year or so, we should be okay. In India, I'm talking. So I think from that perspective, we need to keep a focus on that, and I think that's a very important part of the growth. So I can say only from my perspective, from MG perspective, that we are not changing any plan as of now, and that's what I would like to believe most of the industry will do.